Hello, and welcome to my backyard. There are a lot of questions out there on how to correctly draw a sword in an expedient manner. Many people want to be able to draw the sword fast and cut an object. The difficult part arises is when you don't have the correct patterns to follow to create a good, strong foundation. With that said, let's go over a few of these concepts that will help you in your own backyard. First of all, when you start drawing the sword, you have to remember you're not privy or you don't have a lot of money, so you're not going to go out there and purchase or buy a sword that fits your body correctly. A lot of us just have an old beat up sword that we practice with. Not too expensive, just because we have better places to spend our money in this day and age than a really expensive sword. We can get by on something that is reasonable. What I'd like to talk about is, today I'm going to be using a mogito, or you know it as an iaito, or a fake metal sword, not a sharp steel sword. And when you start drawing the sword, you have to take a couple of things in consideration. And one of them is the angle of the sword compared to the angle of the cut in relation to the angle of your sheath. Because if they're not all lined up correctly, you're going to zig when your sword zags, and over time, you're going to ruin the inside of your sheath. It's just natural the way it happens. Now, the reason why I'm pulling out this old mogito is this thing's been around for 25 years. Everybody in the world has almost drawn this sword, which shows you a lot of bad habits because they were putting pressure on the blade a little differently. What I'd like to worry about, or what I like to talk about, so you worry about it, is the correct angle. Let me get up here a little closer. A lot of times when we draw the sword, we're going to draw the sword out, but at the last second we have a tendency to turn the sword a little differently. It's just that we don't know where it sets up correctly, and then it starts creating a little mess right here. If you look a little bit closer, you can see the sword over time has started ruining the saya right here. So if I bring it up this way, you can see the sword almost scoring out the koiguchi and the beginning part of the saya. What I'd like you to see though is, if I take this and I bring this in and out like this here, you'll see there's a lot of wear. This is a beat up sword. But what I'd like you to look at over time is that this thing has scored here an awful lot. This is what you're doing to your sword inside. You don't see it yet, but when you do a lot of fast drawing, you're going to start scoring out this area here. Over time, you'll probably start cutting into your hands. This is due, not that the sword is too long, but you're not adjusting your body around the sword being drawn. So let's look at this in a little bit more of a full picture. Now, back at this angle, let me put the sword back onto the sheath. Let me take my sword, put it in my belt here like this, and I'm just going to throw this back here. What I'd like you to understand is, when you're cutting something, for example, a water bottle, because those are most prevalent in everybody's house, usually you're holding the sword down this way in more of a horizontal fashion. You start pulling the sword out, and it gets out about this far. The problem is, when you want to do your cut, you got to readjust it somehow. You got this extra space. You got an extra 4 inches on the sword that hasn't been pulled out of the sheath, and you only got so much arm here. And of course, when you get here, all of a sudden you feel like leaning forward this way, or you try to stand up straight, you pull it out, it doesn't work. Case in point, if you try to draw the sword, it doesn't come out this far, and you don't want to start scoring the inside, take the sword at the very beginning of learning these patterns and lift it up to about a 45-degree angle to a 50-degree angle, about right this. And when you lift up the sword, you'll find out it draws from the sheath really easily. Before we were going against our body, but now we're starting to go with our body this way. So as you can see that at the very beginning, if you want your sword to clear the sheath in an expedient manner, you're going to have to take and adjust that sword up this way. But then you start thinking, wait a minute, I want to be able to cut a bottle that's waist high, but I'm lifting the sword above the head. What do I need to do? And that is, don't try to draw in a horizontal fashion at this time. It is a little difficult. And that's why when you see a lot of kata or a lot of professional swordsmen on video, you see a lot of them drawing horizontally because it is the most classical aspect of drawing the sword. And most of the time, they're in a seiza position. But when you're in your own backyard and you're trying to cut different objects, going horizontal sometimes doesn't work for you because you don't have that traditional boost from the Japanese Department of Education from the time you were a young kid all the way to you're an adult. So that's one factor against you. But we'll alleviate some of that problem today. Second, when you want to draw the sword in an expedient manner, you're going to have to remember that you're going to have to take the sword and the sheath and everything and line it up a little bit better. And when I say a little bit better, that just means that if I'm going to be cutting here at this angle, at something about this high, I want to be able to pull the sword out so it comes out straight. And then, after it clears the sheath, I will begin my cut. Whereas, a lot of us as beginners, we're going to try to pull the sword out, and then it gets that last 4 inches and our bodies don't adjust, and you try to throw it out that way, which is not consistent. Again, it scores the inside of your sheath, and moreover, you will have a tendency to cut your body or your hands a little bit more because it isn't as safe. Here are a couple more things to take in consideration from here. When I take the sword and I start drawing it from the sheath, I get it all the way to the end where the kisaki is in my hand here. And after you feel it clear, what I want you to do is not trying to throw it out like that. I want you to do something more simple. Remember, it isn't about your hand. It's about the tip of the sword or the monouchi hitting the target. With that said, we have to remember that we don't want to take our arms and throw it way out like this. We want to have a nice, consistent draw with a strike. So what you'll probably want to do is spend a few hours, a couple of thousand times drawing the sword in this pattern. Now the easiest pattern to deal with is your diagonal pattern, just because it's like that. But you notice when I drew the sword out this way, it got to here and then I started cutting. And that's what I want you to remember is pull and cut. Don't do pull cut. It's pull and cut. So slow down whatever you're doing. Spend a little bit more time making sure the kisaki or the tip of the sword clears. After it clears the sheath, then I want you to use your hand, your wrist, your elbow, and pull it down as you cut forward a little bit this way. What this will do is, this will allow you to cut something down a little bit closer, keeping your arms in for more consistency, and most of all, you'll be able to take the sword and draw it from the sheath a little bit faster and a little bit smoother. So what I'd like you to do now is start drawing the sword and bringing it back and forth this way in your diagonal fashion. After you've done this about 15 or 20 times, then I want you to start working on the finer points, which we will discuss next. Now that you've drawn your sword a couple of dozen times, I want you to adjust your body, I want you to adjust your hips, and I want you now to take the sword and pull it out this way. Just when it gets to the end where you have this difficult angle here, I want you to make sure that the sheath is down as far as it can be. Usually as a guideline, I believe that your little and ring fingers should be touching belt or cloth. That makes it a little bit easier on knowing where you are. If your hand is, for example, your hand and sheath are up here, you're going to have a hard time drawing the sword. Moreover, if it's down here in no man's land, or you have this gray area here, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But any way you look at it, if it doesn't come from your hip, you're going to have a very unadjusted cut, or a cut that doesn't have the right trajectory to cut the object at the best angle. With that said, let's assume that you're having difficulty drawing the sword. So what I'd like you to try is drawing the sword like this, bringing it back a little bit, bringing your elbow in like this, and then making the cut down like that, where you take the draw and sheath and break it up into two complete separate parts. After you've practiced this 15, 20, 30, 40 times, there, pull back, and then cut down, you'll find out that, gee, I don't have to pull the sword out of the sheath as fast as I can. I just have to do it in a nice, smooth rhythm, bring the sword back here to get the power that I need. You really don't need any power, but at this time you figure that, yeah, my muscles, I gotta throw it out there and I've gotta cut as hard as I can, which is understandable. But it isn't like that. Remember, this is a very sharp object. You don't need to use it like a firearm and go bang, bang, bang. You need to just squeeze the trigger, just like in a sword. So take that in consideration. So if I'm out here trying to throw it out that way, it's okay. But if I go 1, 2, 3, and start working on those patterns of cutting, later down the road, my sword will eventually come out of the sheath in a nice straight manner, or the angle that you want to set up to cut your object. Now, one way to alleviate this problem, as far as being able to draw the sword straight out and cut an object, is taking this long sword and going to a shorter one. So for any of you that have a kodachi or wakizashi or any of those swords out there, I'd like to have you use those in place. Sort of look at it like this. Before you go to a big, huge soup spoon, I want you to start eating with a little sugar spoon or a dessert spoon first, so you get the rhythm down. Or instead of starting with a big fork, I want you to start with a smaller dinner fork or salad fork. And the reason why is, if you can correctly create your patterns with a short sword where you don't have to over exaggerate for your body, your arms, your hands, and the direction of the sword will become a little better through practice with a short sword or a military gunto, depending on what you have. With that thought, then later you can go back to a longer sword and readjust it around your body. A lot of times when my students come over to the school, they go, well, you know, my drawing feels pretty good, but something's off a little bit. I take them all back to a shorter sword and let them work with them for a couple hours until they're proficient on drawing and sheathing a shorter sword. Then I take them back to a longer sword. Just because a longer sword, you have to adjust around your body, thus creating bad habits. Just to summarize today's backyard experience, I'd like you to draw the sword, pull it back, and then cut. After you've become proficient with that, I want you to draw the sword out farther, pull it back just a little bit, and cut downward. Remember, again, it's the tip cutting the object and not your hand. Many have a tendency to try to cut it with their hand like a ridge hand this way, which is nice, but the angle of the sword and the direction you're cut through the sheath make that a little difficult. So again, pull out, bring it in, and then cut down. Over time, you'll be able to put this pattern together so it comes out like this in a much more expedient manner. With that said, I hope you enjoy an exciting but safe weekend in your backyard cutting different objects.